Hi, Diamond. Welcome to the Autism Little Learners podcast, and I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Diamond Evita. I also go by Diamond Rashad on Instagram, but I am a pediatric occupational therapist. So I have been doing that for 8 years. I've always loved working with kids, and it feels like a full circle moment because I myself am neurodivergent and I'm part of a neurodiverse family. So it kind of feels like as I am working with clients and working with families, and I'm giving them a piece of the childhood that I didn't have, or where adults didn't quite understand what was going on with me. So yeah, it feels like full circle. So I love that. I am based in Georgia. I work in a outpatient setting. And what else about me? I am a full time auntie, and I love that duty. And I love to read. I love like thrillers. I love romances that have a happy ending in there for sure. And I also love um, just spending time with family, going to the beach, things like that. So that's me.
I love how much you shared because I didn't know that you loved reading thrillers. So do I. So we're going to have to exchange some book ideas.
Oh, yes.
I love that. And the romance with happy endings, that is always great. I feel like Colleen Hoover has a little of both of those. So I've liked reading her lately, but I'll have to DM you for some extra tips and ideas for recommendations.
Right. Because, oh my gosh, that could be a whole like other podcast right there.
It totally could. It totally could. And that you are a proud auntie. I love that too, because my kids are grown up. And so my sisters, I had kids young. And so mine are out of the house, but my sisters have kids that are still in school. And that is my favorite thing is being an auntie to them.
It's the best. You can
I
love
know.
on them, and you get to be like a second mom, and then you can give them back.
Yes. Yes. The last 2 years, I brought my nephew that lives in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So Green Bay Packers, right? I brought him and my stepson up to it's called Door County in Wisconsin. So it's like the big peninsula part of Wisconsin that sticks up
Mhm.
and it's like touristy, beachy, really beautiful. So we go up there and I bring them fishing and he literally just texted me today, "Hey, are we gonna go fishing this May again up in Door County?"
Oh my
So
gosh, I
I
love that.
know. To have a 16-year-old boy ask you that felt pretty special.
That is a huge, huge deal. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited to talk to you, Diamond, about hand over hand prompting. And I saw you talking about it in a recent summit that you presented at. And then I was looking over your Instagram and I saw something posted that said, people are learning and unlearning, and it's helpful to have strategies in your toolbox. And I love this so much, especially when it comes to something like hand over hand prompting with
Mhm.
autistic children. Why is this something we need to unlearn?
Yes, that is a great, great question. And it ties into like when I mentioned learning and unlearning, one that we are all lifelong learners, and the evidence that we learn can evolve over time. So, starting off with acknowledging that I also learned about hand over hand when I was in school, whether that was in an actual classroom or when I was working with clients and being supervised by other OTs. That's what I started off with knowing. And so it's important to unlearn certain strategies as we get more knowledge. So things that we've been exploring more in research and social media, just being able to have access to people from all over the world with diverse perspectives. We know with neurodiversity that being able to have connection over compliance is really, really important. And so hand over hand is one of those examples that can be used to enforce compliance and to violate body autonomy as well. So body autonomy would be recognizing that a client or a child has the right to say, I have control over my body, and this is what my body wants to do, and this is what my body does not want to do, and not forcing that for the goal of meeting what we call neurotypical standards, or what we've seen called neurotypical standards in the past. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to unlearn, is just to start off with acknowledging a person's basic right.
Yeah, and that's something I never heard talked about way back when. And, I have been doing this for 25 years. And so for seasoned speech language pathologists, special educators, OTs, we certainly learned that hand over hand was just a piece of the prompting hierarchy. And when we were talking before the show started here, you said you learned that too, and you're much younger than me, and so it's everywhere where they're still maybe teaching this, or like you said, in your student teaching or practicum, you are exposed to it by a teacher, well-meaning teacher. So I think it's, yeah, unlearning is really important when we especially hear from people who, autistic adults, neurodivergent adults, who are saying this was not the best way. And I don't know, I just think we're starting to hear that more and more and more, and we need to listen, like you said.
Yes, yes, that key part of um, we have one term, like, and I'm sure you see it in all kinds of fields, but when you think about evidence-based practice, like, a key part is listening to the client's needs and preferences. And this is one of those needs. So, and I'll backtrack a little bit too, because something that I hear a lot when I talk about hand over hand is many parents, or even teachers sometimes might say, "Oh, what is hand over hand?" Because sometimes it's called different things, or you might just see it as a physical prompt to get a child started. But hand over hand is you placing your hand on top of a child's hand and either guiding them or forcing them to
Mhm.
engage with an object. So if you're trying to get them started with a puzzle, you're moving their hand on top of the puzzle piece, making them pick it up and put it where you want it to go, or doing half the activity to get them started, because you want to see if that's going to help them get engaged with the task.
Yeah.
So that would be what we consider hand over hand.
Yeah, thank you for defining that because, we want to make sure we know exactly what we're talking about here when we're talking about unlearning. And that example you just gave with the puzzle, I'm sure that we can all think of students or clients, or if you're a parent, your own child who did not or does not respond well to this touch. And they respond negatively to this hand over hand prompting. And so I can picture students in the past who would try to pull their hand away or become dysregulated when someone was attempting hand over hand. So, what could we do instead of hand over hand prompting? And I know you have more than one idea on that.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. So um yeah, there's a couple different directions that you can go in. So sensory wise, like you mentioned, some children don't like to be touched in the first place. So they don't like hugs, or they are very sensory sensitive when it comes to input from touch. And so we want to be really mindful of that. On the opposite end, you might also have children that are sensory seekers, or they love deep pressure, they love deep hugs. You might see them like play with things a little bit roughly, or they are running into the walls, or they're narrowly missing like furniture because they don't quite know where they are in space without having that like heavy pressure on them. And so sometimes it might seem like it works to have hand over hand, because they do get that extra deep pressure from your hand being on top, but it doesn't teach them how to engage with the task on their own. So in that example, what I would do instead of hand over hand would be, I would make sure that the object that they're engaging with is a little bit heavier, or that it has extra texture on it, so that they can feel it on the palm of their hand instead of feeling it, it's the texture on the outside of their hand, where you're putting your hand on top, having texture on the inside, so they can feel that deep pressure where the object actually is and get that input there, and better be able to engage with a task on their own with their own internal motivation. So some other things that you can utilize as well is considering their regulation. So if a child is having a hard time with sitting to the table, engaging with an activity, we can also start with considering, are they regulated enough for this task? So I might recognize, okay, are they overstimulated or are they understimulated? If they are overstimulated, then I might lower the lights. I might use some natural lighting if I can. We might, well, probably the first thing I usually do is get them away from the table, and we might sit on the floor instead. We might have some bean bags going on, changing the sitting positioning to make it easier for them. I might break down the task so that they can get some movement in. And if they need to jump on the trampoline, if they need to get some kind of sensory input before they engage with the task or combine the two together, I love to do that. I love to, like, or for example, if we're doing writing, if we're doing, I'll use writing, but writing puzzle, blocks, things like that. I might have them, we do a running activity and then we make a mark on the chalkboard every time we do a running activity. And so that way they get that physical activity. And then also are, working on the task that we originally thought of if they're interested in it. If they are understimulated, then I may increase the sensory input that's in the activity. So, for example, if we're doing a board game, I might put some of the pieces inside a sensory bin so they get that texture. And then they find a piece of the board game and then they can put it on the board, or they can take their turn that way. So they get that extra texture that way. We might add in doing a lot of sensory work before the activity. So not sitting at the table too long in the first place. We might do things on the crash pad to just prep their bodies and make them feel like they can feel regulated or take a break if they need to. So that's another consideration as well. Hand under hand is a great tool that you can use. So you can have their hand on top of yours so that they are in control of their bodies and they're in control of what action their body takes, but then they still get help from you on how to engage with the activity. Because
Yeah.
sometimes it's just that, like, many kids are visual learners and activity is visually either not engaging or it's confusing. They don't know when to start, they don't know when to end, they're not sure how to navigate the activity, and so they're over it and then they just go do something else. But it's like, oh, I know that toy over there, I know this pop it, I know this trampoline, I'll just do that instead.
Diamond, I loved all of those ideas that you gave. And one that stuck out in particular was making like the puzzle piece have texture on it so it touches the palm of their hand. And also, I was thinking, man, you could take those puzzle pieces and put them in the sensory bin, like you talked about with the other activity. And kids would naturally go in and reach and take them out, get that sensory input. And I think that would be, I mean, just so many ideas. You gave me so many. I can't even go over each of them because I can't remember all of them. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this and
There,
write them down. So I'm telling everyone listening, you might want to listen to that section a couple times and write down these ideas for activities because they all sounded like they'd be really motivating for kids and real life things that you can actually do in the classroom or at home.
yeah, and there's a lot of options out there. There's music, there's the sensory bin, like I mentioned. There's using video modeling, picture cards can be super helpful. But the strategies that are out there really just help us with starting the task and realizing that we can modify the environment instead of trying to modify the child. And
Yeah.
that's something that's super important. Like thinking about in occupational therapy, we have a model called person, environment, occupation. And occupation would be the activity or the task. And so my mindset with this is instead of focusing on what we want the child to do, how can we best set up the environment and best set up the task so that it is easier for the kid to achieve it, that it's clear to the kid. And that also goes into neurodiversity and the social model of disability as well, right? Is
Yeah.
that just like you might see when you are at home with your child, they can do a lot of different things. They can do a lot of different activities, and then, or they say a lot of different words. And then, let's say you take them into a different environment, a new environment where they've never been before, they don't recognize that therapist might ask them to do certain activities and they don't do it. It's not because they don't have the skills, it's because it's a different environment and the everything is the task is different based
Mhm.
on that transition. So I was thinking about the transition into it, the unknown, not having a relationship with that person, all those things are different.
Yeah.
And so it's modifying the environment or recognizing that the environment is different gives the child and gives you a lot of grace to recognize, okay, well, this might be why this task is not working out for us, whether that is a play task, a task that you do for play based learning, or just in the classroom as well. There's a lot of different reasons on why a kid might not engage with an activity. And it's not usually the kid, it's usually the task or the regulation or the environment going on.
Yeah, that is such a good point, and it made me think of a little guy that I had a couple years ago in the classroom, and it was time, I think it was parent-teacher conferences, and we were meeting with his, or it was an IEP, we were meeting with the parents, and the OT was, and she's wonderful. She was saying, we're still working on tracing letters, but it's not something he's shown me or done in the school, in school setting yet. And mom said, "Oh, really? He can trace all his letters at home." And I think sometimes professionals at that point maybe don't believe the parent. And my experience in 25 years has shown me the parent knows their
Yes.
parent is right about that. And just because we haven't seen it, it's exactly what you just talked about. So this little guy, my head was like, okay, are we presenting tracing letters on different materials, like, paper versus a whiteboard? What directions are we giving that might be different than the way mom says it? So, this is the speech language pathologist in me. If we're giving different directions than mom is, then he may not understand what we're even asking him to do. And then he was a kid that had trouble getting started with a lot of things. And so I asked mom, could you send me a video of you and him doing this together, including your prompting? And so she sent it, and we're like, "Oh, okay, so it was on a whiteboard. This is the direction she gave." But I also absolutely love video modeling. So I just simply pulled out a whiteboard and a marker and sat with him and played the video, and he did it. So he just needed that boost transferring the skill into school, and that's our job, right? He's not gonna
Yes.
tell us like, "Oh, you're doing it different than my mom." Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's it's our job to build our toolkit so we can one recognize where the barrier might be
Mhm.
and then say, okay, well, what strategies do I have that might be a good fit for this child? Or
Yeah.
how can I break down this task a little bit more so that it makes sense to them? For example, like if a child is not comes into a classroom and doesn't put their backpack away or doesn't put it in their cubby, and instead of grabbing their hand and making them hold on to the handle and walking them over, what steps in the task do they not have the skills for yet, or what are the barriers to them completing that and breaking it down that way? Do they recognize that that's their backpack? Will they pick it up at the end of the day? And if we
Yeah.
start there, then we might be able to work up to doing that on their own instead of going straight to this is how I'm going to make you do the activity.
Right. That really got me thinking and reading some of your things about, if you're doing hand over hand, making a child do something, it might be one clue that that activity is not at the right level for them yet, and maybe they could do a piece of it, like you're just saying, break it down. And with that example with the backpack, we did backpacks every day for 25 years, and the the example you gave made me think, okay, so many of our kids would do that, like, just drop the backpack in the hall. They probably don't recognize the spot where their backpack is supposed to go. So could we start with just a big bucket with a picture of their favorite character on it, like their Paw Patrol character, and
Mhm.
show them to just plop it in there? Because maybe they don't have the fine motor yet to, like, get the loop over the hook, and having a bucket gets them closer to that, to
Yes.
recognizing their spot. Is that kinda along the lines of what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I mean. And then once they've mastered that, you can even put the bucket inside their cubby. You can break it down and work up to it. So
Yeah.
that was a good example. If you are listening on the podcast, I'm like nodding my head up and down, like, yes, yes, that's exactly it. Yes.
'Cause I think sometimes people think, "Well, I have to do hand over hand because they aren't doing this." But I just love that idea of breaking it down into smaller pieces because that wouldn't require any hand over hand. And like you said, you can start the bucket maybe by the door, wherever they usually drop it, or you
Mhm.
could bring it and catch it, and then kinda make it closer and closer to their cubby until it's in their cubby area. So,
Yeah,
that's a
yeah,
fun example.
exactly.
Fun
Yeah,
example to
breaking it
brainstorm.
down.
Yeah.
I can see your brain going,
Yes.
comes with a master plan. And
Yeah.
I'll give you another example too. I have a family member that is in physical therapy and in occupational therapy as well. And both of their therapists are amazing. The physical therapist, um, this child has difficulties with balance and difficulties with recognizing their body in space, and so they're working on a balance beam and stepping stones, and so the child will try it and then come off. So what she did was she recognized it was a balance issue, and so sometimes therapists that don't recognize that might just try to move the child's legs so they can see like this is
Mm.
where you're supposed to put your feet. But she instead grabbed their hands to lessen the load of the balance
Oh,
or
yeah.
make it not as difficult to grade down the activity. And then they did the whole thing by themselves.
Oh,
And by the end of the session, they did the entire thing by themselves with no hands at all. And they're just recognizing, okay, well, this is the barrier, and this is how I can modify it to make it easier
yeah.
instead of like making them go through it step by step, and then they're not learning anything.
Yeah. And maybe when you discover things like that, I'm thinking of a classroom setting, a preschool classroom setting. That teacher has a lot of kids that are at different levels. Some can maybe hang up their backpack on their own, and some need a different variation. So maybe even writing it down so that your team can be on the same page about it, because
Mhm.
that would help everyone and help transitions run smoother. And being on the same page is so important.
Yes, for sure, because you're navigating a lot in the classroom, and that's one very distinct difference.
Mhm.
Being able to work in the outpatient setting is that I'm usually working with one child at a
Yeah.
time, so being able to communicate with everyone on the team, and make small adjustments and see what works and what doesn't work so that y'all can all collaborate together and find the best fit for the child.
Yeah.
And hand over hand in itself, you can use it. Um, it's 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 used in some practices, especially if someone is relearning how to use their muscles.
Mm.
Um, but the key part is active participation in it. And so
Yeah.
that's where that consent piece comes in. So if a kid wants help, then you can certainly help them with hand over hand, but that consent piece is the essential part of it too.
Yeah, and I think with something that you talked about before, you said it's okay to ask for consent, even if it's a 3-year-old, even if they're non-speaking, you can hold out your hand, and consent might look like them putting their hand in your hand. Or obviously, if they can speak, they can give verbal consent. But kids who would, if you put out your hand, some might pull away, like, no, thanks. And
Mhm.
so, really looking at that multimodal communication when it comes to consent. Is there anything else surrounding that that you can think of as a tip? Um, I think just asking and really watching them.
Yes, I would say asking, watching, and waiting, because many autistic learners need time to motor plan and figure out what they want to do. Even if a child walks away from an activity completely, that doesn't always mean that they're done with it. They might see something and they want to come back, or they want to grab a toy they really like, and then they'll come back and engage with the
Yeah.
activity with you. So I, like you said, I might put up my hand and say, "Help, please." And I just keep my hand there for a minute, a little bit. I'm like all for awkward silence, like, it's okay, I'll wait. And they might not respond. No, I'll say, okay, no problem. You
Yeah.
don't need help. You can also hand the piece to a child as well too. So if they don't want to put their
Yeah.
hand in yours, you can just hand them the piece so that they recognize, oh, you want me to start with this piece first, this piece of
Yeah.
the task.
And that's maybe for kids who don't initiate. Let's say we're sitting at a table with a puzzle and they would just sit there because initiation can be hard for certain kids. And you don't want to, bombard them with like, put the puzzle piece in, do this, too much talking. A non-verbal way to do it would be to hand them the first piece. And I found that really helpful with any activity in the classroom, whether it was a matching activity or a puzzle. Once the child is there at the activity, just handing them the first piece. And then that's like, "Oh, yeah, that's what I'm supposed to do here." It's
Hmm.
helpful.
And you can use that for a lot of things. You can use that with, I've done that with drawing.
Oh, yeah.
So if we're drawing shapes, I'll draw half the circle
Yeah.
and then I'll hand them the marker and say, okay, your turn. And
Yeah.
sometimes they'll finish it, sometimes they'll draw something very different. I'll say, okay,
Yeah.
good try.
Yeah.
That's something. But sometimes that visual piece is just super helpful. Same thing with like self-care and dressing, handing a sock or just holding the sock open and having them do half of the activity, chaining the activity so that you're helping some, they're helping some,
Yeah.
helping with that task initiation or task continuation, can be really, really helpful for kids.
Yeah, I like that. The other thing I found for some kids is having the task or activity broken down into like a almost like a visual schedule or visual sequence, we'll call it. So, like the schedule gets them to the activity or area, but then they look at the task or activity and they're like, what am I supposed to do? So, even having visuals to break down like the steps to washing hands and stuff like that, then you could point to it and that might spur them to get going with it versus you taking their hand and putting it in the water.
Yes, yes. The Having a visual schedule that tells the order of things. Some children do well with clip art. Some kids do well with actual pictures of themselves,
Yeah,
or even a familiar adult doing the activity. If you can find it, it's also worked for me to even use like pictures from a cartoon as well. They recognize characters.
yeah.
Sometimes that helps as well. Because there's many like scenes out there sometimes where a cartoon character is brushing their teeth or eating or
Mhm.
engaging with a toy or of some sort. And so that makes it a lot easier too.
It's funny you mentioned that, Diamond, because using like passions and special interest has been my jam over all these years because I used it back when I was at the elementary level with these twins that I had, and it worked so well that every student I have, I'm always asking their parents, like, what do they love? What's their favorite character? What's their favorite, song? So I had, this is many years ago, I had twins in my elementary classroom, special ed classroom, and they were both autistic. They were non-speaking, and they were in second grade at this time. And their mom was like, "Oh, I just want them potty trained." So we really that year were like, "Okay, we're gonna do it. We're gonna get them potty trained." But I was like, "We have to use their interest. Otherwise, they're kind of like, meh, they won't even look at something unless it's of interest to them." And so I'm like, "Okay, they love country singers so much." So I made a book, kind of like a social story and it had the board maker picture from the waist down showing peeing in the potty with the yellow dots going into the toilet. And then from the waist up, I used Google Images and cut out pictures of singers and glued them on. And then I put like Clint Black peas in the potty, Willie Nelson peas in the potty. And those boys, if they were just given any book that they didn't care for, they wouldn't even turn the pages. Both of them flipped through it really, really fast, and they peed in the potty that day.
Oh my gosh, I
And
love that.
as an OT, you will like this part too. So then I took that and put it into every area of learning. And so we thought that they just were their muscles were too weak and like holding up pen, they were very light or marker, and they weren't tracing anything. So I dotted out the names on paper to all of the country singers they loved to make a kind of a tracing activity. Boom. Those boys could trace those. They had no interest in tracing their own name, but
Mhm.
tracing those is like this wasn't a skill necessarily that was missing. It was that motivation. And so using those passions can help us find out what skills they already have that we didn't know and teach new skills too.
Yes. Oh my gosh, absolutely. That
Super fun.
motivation piece as well. Like, and yeah, and also goes into that connection piece too. Like you
Yes.
want to learn so much more when a person understands you and
Yeah.
connects to you and recognizes like your interests and who you are as a person. It motivates you as
Yeah.
well, like the actual special, either special interest or focus interest. And then also just recognizing, wow, this person gets me. This is a safe space for me
Yeah.
to try new things.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that is exactly it. That connection is so important. One last question. So, what about safety issues when they arise? I mean, I think we just need to say this. Like if a child grabs something dangerous or is running towards the road,
Hmm.
at that point, if we needed to use hand over hand to help them, we obviously would, right?
Right. Yes. So that is a great subject. So when I think about hand over hand, you can use it for different situations, right? And so when it comes to hand over hand, when it comes to learning, when it comes to play, if you can modify the task, then
Hmm.
just go ahead and do that. And I think about that mainly with scissors.
Hmm.
Oh my gosh, that's a whole thing. So you can start off with, if you still want to teach that skill, use Play-Doh scissors or use
Yeah.
loop scissors that make it easier for you to assist the child with the activity so that they're not cutting themselves or cutting their hair
Yeah.
or, taking off and running around with the scissors because you're nervous about giving hand over hand. You can do hand under hand to help teach those skills. Like I said, with the loop scissors, which are the scissors that don't have the hand holes in them, they just have a loop at the end.
Hmm.
I just hold on to the end of the loop. So that way, if a child gets distracted or if something else is going on and they drop them, it's not a big deal. I'm like, okay, I still have control over the activity and the tool, but I'm not trying to control the child. So that's one example.
Yeah. Yeah.
When it comes to situations where you are not teaching a child, maybe you are just in a community setting and you are just trying to get through the task, it is okay to grab the kid's hand to walk across the street. Like there's no judgment in whatever safety tool that you need to use to make sure your child is safe, whether that is the leash backpacks, whether that's hand over
Yeah.
hand. And sometimes I'll even hold a kid's hand and loop my pinky across their wrist too to make sure they don't try to pull their hand and run off, because
Yeah.
that's not a time to teach that skill, when there are so many factors out there that we can't control. We're just trying to
Yeah.
get into the car, right? Um, Another example would be like if a child is engaging in like unsafe behaviors, like jumping off of furniture where they might hurt themselves, like there's not a crash pad there or there's not something there that is going to protect their bodies, um, it's great to redirect them to another place that is safer where they can get that sensory input. but um, it's that's the main focus is make sure that they're safe, not necessarily being like, oh well, do I have consent to hold your hand? Now I'm just gonna grab the kid and say, okay, okay,
Yeah.
I'm gonna help you get down now, and then I'm gonna
Yeah.
pick them up and help them get down. So those are some
Yeah.
examples of where like safety definitely comes first.
Yeah. Thank you so much for addressing that.
Oh yeah, no,
So,
for sure.
for those of you that don't follow Diamond on Instagram yet, you need to because she has so many of these practical tips in like bite-sized little videos or graphics. So you need to go follow her. Where can everybody find you, Diamond?
Yeah, so I am mainly on Instagram, so you can find me at a dime of OT there. And like you said, I post little graphics and videos and reels and things like that that can be helpful for parents, for speech therapists, for OTs, for
Hmm.
physical therapists, and really try to put information out there that'll be helpful for wherever you are in life. You can also find me on Facebook. I'm at the same name, Adama OT. And then I also have a blog, adamnot.com. You can find me there where I have some printable handouts that you can access. I have a few blog posts that can be really helpful. And then I also have some courses that are listed on there, as well as past courses that I've done, like or like summits and things that I've done that you can access there as well.
Awesome. Awesome. I have to say, like over the years, OTs have been my favorite people to work with. And so I'm adding you to the list now because you have such awesome ideas and you're so child focused and what's best for kids. And I love that. So,
Thank you. I appreciate that so
yeah.
much.
Yeah. And I will put all of your links in the show notes for everybody so that they can just click and find you.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. I can't wait until we talk again.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.